Tonight on assignment, John Ray is in New York with the remarkable story of Hart Island and one mother's search for the daughter she lost.
I'm feeling elated that I'm getting to do this, but sad that it took 36 years. I'm hoping that it's pretty.
Geraint Vincent reports from East Jerusalem. Now that their house has been demolished, what does the future hold for this Israeli Jew, her Arab husband, and their children?
You raised them to think that Jews and Arabs were the same,
yes,
and that they...
Of course. I told them love, but my government told them hate.
And I'm in Jamaica, meeting those who say they're still suffering from the consequences of slavery and that Britain should apologize and pay for it.
Our blood, sweat and tears created the wealth in the UK.
Good evening and welcome to On Assignment. Each month our news correspondents bring you revealing stories that take you behind the headlines. We start tonight with an island in New York that many of the locals don't even know about. For more than a century, inmates from a nearby prison have been burying the city's homeless there, as well as the unclaimed dead and infants whose lives were cut short. John Ray joined one woman who's campaigned for years to lay flowers at the site of her child's grave and who now has, at last, the opportunity to do so.
It's a new day in New York, a skyline just a few miles from the skyscrapers of Manhattan, yet a world removed. For Elaine Joseph, dawn marks a long journey's end.
I'm nervous. It's a special day.
She's about to board a ferry to a place where the living rarely tread.
I'm feeling elated that I'm getting to do this, but sad that it took 36 years.
It's called Hart Island, and somehow in this city, in this century, the site of freshly turned earth, a mass grave for the destitute, the nameless, and some whose lives were measured in precious moments.
I'm hoping that it's pretty.
This really is the sleepiest of shores. It's the kind of place that New Yorkers come to enjoy the peace and tranquility and also the view. But what so few of them know is that across this short stretch of water is an island of lost souls. It's the place that New York buries its dead, the unknown and the unwanted, but not always the forgotten. This is the extraordinary story of one mother's search for her daughter.
I remember her little face. I remember she had chubby little cheeks. And I remember she had a little weak cry.
Her name was Tamika.
And I have her little footprints.
And this is the only memento of her short life.
The nurse held her up and said, look, here's your baby. Here's your baby. She's beautiful. I looked at her, I said, oh, she really is beautiful, but she's gonna die.
It was 1978. Tamika was 2 months premature, frail and sick. Elaine went home to rest. A cab ride through Central Park she can never forget.
It was the last time I would ever see my baby, alive or dead.
All over New York, automobiles were buried in snow piles.
A great blizzard closed the city. Tamika was rushed to emergency surgery. The snow stranded Elaine at home.
I regret that terribly, that she died alone.
She rang the hospital to arrange a funeral and was given stunning news.
They said, you signed the form so that we can bury her. The city will bury her. I didn't sign anything. They said, yes, you did. The body's already gone. You signed the form. But don't worry, because the city buries her with babies and stillborns. She'll be buried with babies and stillborns.
As if that was...
Okay.
Okay. That would make it better.
Yeah, but it didn't.
There was no mention of Hart Island on the burial certificate. For Elaine, it was as if Tamika had vanished without trace.
Anyone who's a parent, a mother, a father, you can't let it go. That's a part of you that's gone.
This is a Polish gentleman named Jan Winiarski.
Elaine's first clue about Hart Island came when she heard about Melinda Hunt, who has dedicated years to putting names to those buried there.
That we could have a place so dark and inaccessible, that just isn't part of who we are as Americans.
For more than a century on Hart Island, New York has dumped its unwanted problems out of sight and out of mind. A past that can be glimpsed in its ruins, a reformatory school, a TB hospital, an asylum for the insane, and the last resting place for 1 million New Yorkers. 150 years on, they are still digging deep trenches here, still stacking the coffins every week, around 120 every month.
It's a really overwhelming experience.
Melinda is one of the few outsiders to have witnessed these burials.
A morgue truck arrives and it's full of coffins, especially if it's baby coffins, and there's 50 or 60 at once.
Just as rare are these images filmed in the 1990s but unchanged today.
They line them up, sort of like UPS, unloading these boxes.
There's no ceremony, no prayers, no priests, and the gravediggers are convicts paid 50 cents an hour.
Each child had a mother that was not there.
A quirk of history means Hart Island is run by the Department of Correction, New York's prison authority, though here the security is to keep people out. And prison rules apply, so only after months of negotiation are long years of searching ending at last.
It's been 36 years. It's your time now. I never thought I'd see this day.
The authorities have refused us permission to film on the island, but Elaine wants us to follow as closely as we can. A journey that for a few fleeting minutes will take her at last to Tamika's grave.
Looks like a big empty field. And no grave markers or anything. There were tractor marks, like they had driven tractors over it. It was surreal. We had to walk over mass graves to get to the spot where my baby was buried. The Department of Corrections captain that works on the island, who runs this island, he, out of the goodness of his heart, put flowers on my daughter's grave. It actually brought out the good, in people. It had me in tears. I knelt to the ground. And
You felt close to her?
I did.
Closer than any time in
36 years, yeah.
The Department of Correction declined the opportunity to speak to us on camera, but it told us that although it does its best to allow family members to visit Hart Island, the cemetery there lacks the infrastructure to safely allow large numbers of visitors to wander around the grounds. In a city that lingers longer in the memory than most, there is one more monument Elaine would like to add, and that is to turn Hart Island into a public park so anyone can visit any time. It is, she says, the least New York that teams with so much life can do for the dead.
I think it would be a fitting memorial for Tamika and every other baby and adult that is buried there.
So that Hart Island is no longer New York's shameful secret.
Elaine and 7 other mothers have now started an official campaign to allow open access to the island for all the relatives who want to visit it. Next, the deadline set by America for some kind of agreement to be reached in talks between Israel and the Palestinians expired yesterday. US Secretary of State John Kerry had been keen to bring greater stability to this part of the Middle East, but negotiations ceased months ago and the argument about land and property continues. It's a familiar story in Jerusalem, but there is something unique about Geraint Vincent's report tonight on the demolition of homes.
There is a pile of rubble in East Jerusalem, twisted steel and crumbled concrete, signs that something once stood here. There's a television and some cupboard doors, fragments of a family life.
Everything was beautiful, beautiful. My life was beautiful, was perfect.
Moran and her husband, Mohammed, are showing me around what used to be their home. The home they built 18 years ago on land which Mohammed says has been in his family for generations. Before dawn, a couple of days previously, they tell me that they were woken up and forced out by the Israeli security forces, and a demolition team then made short work of destroying their house. What, so they did it in an hour?
In an hour, an hour and a half maximum. It was all gone.
A neighbour captured the demolition being carried out on a mobile phone, on a morning when the neighbourhood filled with the security forces. A morning when Moran says her family was terrified and traumatised.
Now I have broken family. We are a broken family.
Home, for now, is a tent put up in what used to be their front yard. Inside there's not much room to play. The children hold tight to the toys they managed to take with them before the house came down. But there's a twist to this tale of Palestinian suffering. These children's mother was born an Israeli Jew. Moran was brought up just outside Tel Aviv. After serving in Israel's armed forces, she converted to Islam so that she could marry the man she fell in love with, Mohammed, who's an Arab from East Jerusalem. It's too difficult. And who's now too humiliated to talk about what happened to their home.
I can't answer my children her questions. They said to me, why us? Why us? They destroy my room. They destroy my life. They destroy everything that I born for. And I have no answer. I have just no answer to them.
Because you raised them to think that Jews and Arabs were the same,
Yes,
and that they're equal?
Yeah. Yes, of course.
What, and that doesn't make sense now to them?
No. No. I told them love, but my government told them hate.
What happened to Moran and Mohammed isn't unusual, according to a group of leading aid organisations, which says that the rate at which Palestinian homes are being knocked down in East Jerusalem has increased since the latest round of peace talks began. The local authority, Jerusalem's municipality, wouldn't give me an interview about how it decides which houses get knocked down, but it did give me a written statement. It says that home demolitions in the city are the result of court orders on homes that are built illegally. And in Mohammed and Moran's case, they say the house was built without permits or planning and that it stood on an area of ground where construction is prohibited. But for the Palestinian political leadership, that planning law is the law of the occupier.
Anybody who believes this garbage, who believes such language, has no relationship to the reality, has not looked at realities on the ground. Palestinians have no recourse. The Israeli judicial system has never been objective to the Palestinians, and it has become part of an ongoing strategy to change the demographic realities of Jerusalem in particular, but of Palestine in general, and to continue with an ethnic cleansing policy and of a vision of exclusivity.
Out of the rubble of demolitions come heavy accusations which the Israeli authorities reject.
I think, unfortunately, with too many of the PLO leadership, there's a language of demonization. Israel is portrayed as something evil, as the root of all the problems. That all comes from one side, our side. And people whose houses are being demolished, it's only because that construction is in violation of the building code. And that has to be done for safety reasons, for public policy planning reasons, and so forth. And any sort of charge that this is somehow directed against Jerusalem's Arab population is baseless.
While some houses are being knocked down in the districts of East Jerusalem, many more are being built. More than 700 this year alone. Apartments for Jewish people settling on land Israel won by war. When diplomats talk about how the window of opportunity for peace is closing, this is what they're talking about. That Israel is changing the nature of the land to such an extent that it will no longer be possible to build a Palestinian state here. And Israel's greatest ally is warning it to stop. It's America which is leading the current peace effort, and throughout, Washington has said that settlements lessen the already slim chance of an agreement.
In every peace plan that's been put on the table, I'm not talking about Israeli peace plans, I've been talking about international peace plans. In all of them, the Jewish neighborhoods of Jerusalem remain part of Israel in final status peace. And so I'd ask you, if Israel is building in areas that anyway will remain part of Israel in final status peace, how can that be a problem to reach an agreement?
It's kind of against the spirit of the talks and the effort, though, isn't it?
To tell the government of Israel that it's forbidden to build in our capital city for our people, I mean, that's not logical.
In the corner of the city where our story started, there's more construction, but not with Israeli government approval. Moran and her family are building a new home in exactly the same spot where the old one once stood.
Yes, of course, it's my land. Where I should go. It's my legal land. It's not their land, it's my land. It's the grandmother of my husband's land.
If it goes on, I mean, you live in fear of the authorities coming back, don't you? What happens?
I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know. I pray to the best.
So there's defiance on this doorstep, but there's uncertainty too. And despite what their mother used to tell them, a group of children who are struggling to see the conflict they were born into from both sides.
Geraint Vincent in East Jerusalem. A coalition of Caribbean countries have come together to demand reparations from Britain and other European nations to overcome what they say is the devastating legacy of slavery. In Jamaica, campaigners argue that everything from a poor education system to communities trapped in cycles of poverty can be traced back to Britain's involvement in the trade. I travelled to the island to see what lies behind these claims. Golden beaches and azure waters of Jamaica's northern coast, a magnet for nearly 2 million tourists each year. Dotted along this stunning coastline, you find lots of resorts which are international success stories, but which were started on this island. On the face of it, this is the Jamaica we all know. The beautiful, tropical tourist paradise full of thriving resorts that we come to in our thousands every year to holiday. But this is very far from the whole story. Tourism makes up less than 1/10 of the economy. It cannot mask the realities of life for many. There are few industries offering jobs outside of tourism and sugar production. Jamaica is the 4th most indebted country in the world, where nearly 20% of the population live on or below the poverty line, almost double what it was 7 years ago. To understand why many Jamaicans believe their current problems are linked to slavery, I travelled a few miles down the road to Seville, where the first British slave owners arrived. This was the first plantation they built. The reparations campaign asking Britain for compensation is nothing new. It's been going for nearly 100 years, but has only now got the backing of all 15 Caribbean countries. Professor Vereen Shepherd is lead advisor to the Jamaican government on the case.
When it comes to the transatlantic trade, the bulk of the responsibility in terms of Jamaica lies with the British.
And what would you say to someone in Britain who empathizes with much of what you say? Why do I have to reach into my pocket? I didn't benefit from it.
But I would say, yes, you did. Yes, you did. Because the resources of the Caribbean were put into the industrialization of Britain. Our blood, sweat, and tears created the wealth in the UK. But we're not asking every individual person in Britain to line up and take money from their pockets. The present state must still take responsibility, you know, for the actions of past regimes.
Caribbean countries have formed what they call a 10-point plan, a manifesto for how the reparations money would be spent. High amongst them is poverty. I travelled to the far east of the island, to Golden Grove, where campaigners say many are still dependent on little more than the sugar plantations built by slave owners. This is why Britain came to the Caribbean. The sugar produced for hundreds of years in awful conditions by slaves in these plantations produced unimaginable wealth for British slave owners and for British merchants and companies. At the heart of the campaign by Caribbean countries is the claim that colonial powers like Britain not only took the trillions of pounds they made out of slavery, they did virtually nothing to develop the infrastructure of the region. Reparations, they argue, is the only way to fund a way out of this. So this field is where you used to work?
To work.
Yeah. Elias Thomas worked on this plantation for nearly half a century until he retired last year, saying there were no other livelihoods available to him. He grew up listening to stories of how his forefathers were enslaved on these fields. These are the same fields that slaves used to work in as well hundreds of years ago?
Yes, of course. This same field, no change.
How do you feel when you come back?
I don't feel pretty. The reason why I don't feel pretty is what I earn. I can't feel good over it.
Do you feel angry?
Yeah. Right now I don't feel good.
48 years and little to show for it.
This is the bedroom. And where I sleep.
Elias shares this house with his wife and grown children. He told me he's desperate to escape such conditions and has tried all his life, but couldn't. And he said he believed that reparations from Britain would help get him out of such poverty. When slavery was abolished, many fled the plantations and headed to the cities in search of better lives. They ended up in places like Riverton, in the capital Kingston, today one of the poorest areas in the country. Britain continued to rule until 1962, but just as with rural areas, the UK left very little infrastructure or other industries in urban areas, forcing some to make their own living.
Sometimes we're hungry. Most time we have to go on the dump to find food to eat, maybe to find even clothes to wear.
In the bars and restaurants of uptown Kingston, there are plenty of people whose ancestors arrived as slaves who are now thriving financially. It begs the question whether all Jamaicans blame Britain and the colonial past for the country's current problems.
You must come across people, fellow Jamaicans, who argue that we've got to deal with them, not look to Europe and Britain to pay to fix our problems now.
Yes. There are many people like those. People argue that we should move on. But in my view, those are people who don't understand the connection between the past and the present.
The link between past and present is at the heart of a rare education project at Liberty Hall. Caribbean countries say that when British rule ended, the majority of black people were functionally illiterate, and they're still dealing with the consequences. Jamaica spends double the amount on education than it does on health. Campaigners argue this isn't enough and claim some government schools are still using books with the same syllabus as the colonial era.
Do government schools teach things beyond the colonial experience?
No, absolutely not. At school, their teachers basically teach them a narrative that their history began with the enslavement of their ancestors. And for many of us, that is a badge of shame. Your ancestors were brought here.
Campaigners say reparations from Britain would help pay for new books that teach children to be proud of their African heritage and give them the confidence to realise the kind of dreams their parents couldn't fulfil.
Great Africans. My parents didn't have the money for me to go to college. My daughter that wants to be like a doctor now, this separation process will help her very much. They are the future of tomorrow.
Britain has already expressed deep sorrow and regret for the suffering of the slave trade. It says it wants to help countries like Jamaica move forward, but not through reparations and looking to the past. The word reparations conjures up images of a huge payout, a punitive payment for colonial wrongdoing. But on my journey through Jamaica, I've learned that the claims being made against Britain are for very specific reasons. They're based on the belief that Jamaica has been held back because Britain left behind a country with little resources to develop itself. Campaigners are saying this can only be put right with the help of British money. The British government told us that so far they've not had a formal approach from the Caribbean countries, but the Jamaican Prime Minister is hoping to meet with them in the next few months. Well, that's it for this episode. Until next time, from all of us on the programme, good night.
Yes.